Imagine that you are in a museum. It is late. The lights have begun to turn off in the side corridors, and only a dim glow remains over the oldest paintings. You approach a huge, dark canvas, almost threatening, an oil painting from the 17th century. In the center, an old man with a white beard raises his arms to the sky while the waters part around him. The sea opens up. The people pass by. The glory of God seems tangible. You look. And then, right next to the painting, almost hidden, you notice a small piece of paper stuck to the wall. A note. It is handwritten, in small letters. You need to get closer to read it. The note simply says, "This never happened the way they told you." Who wrote this note? A madman, a bitter atheist, a disturbed iconoclast? No. It was written by Baruch Spinoza, a philosopher born in Amsterdam in 1632, the son of Sephardic Jews who fled the Portuguese Inquisition, raised within the strictest traditions of Judaism, and who at the age of 24 was expelled from his community with a curse so violent that even today historians fall silent when reading it aloud. Spinoza did not write this note out of hatred. He did not write it out of vanity, nor out of a desire for scandal. He wrote it because he spent years and years within the sacred texts, original Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, Latin, and found something that no one wanted to see, something that was there, on the surface, visible to anyone who had the courage to look without blinders. Moses did not write the 5 books attributed to him. The narrative of the Exodus is permeated with internal contradictions that can only be explained by a deliberate political construction, and the God that Moses proclaimed to the people of the desert was not the God of reason. It was a tool of control, carefully sculpted to keep a people obedient, united, and submissive to a single authority. This is not anti-Christianity. It is not anti-Semitism. It is not simplistic atheism. It is a philosophical and textual analysis that Spinoza developed with absolute rigor, published at the risk of his life, and that shook the foundations of Western theology in a way from which it has not yet fully recovered. And the most disturbing thing of all, the evidence is in the Bible. You do not need to go to any external source. You do not need to consult any alternative tradition. Just open the sacred text with Spinoza's eyes, and what you will see will forever change the way you understand not only religion, but power, obedience, and human nature. In the next 14 blocks, we will do exactly that. We will enter the mind of one of the greatest thinkers the world has ever produced. We will traverse the texts he studied. We will understand the evidence he presented, and we will arrive, each of us, at our own conclusion. But I need to warn you before we begin. Some questions, once asked, cannot be undone. Some ideas, once understood, do not become invisible again. You have come this far because you are the kind of person who seeks true answers, not comforting ones. So prepare yourself, because what Spinoza discovered in the Bible will make you see the most read book in history with completely new eyes. And it all begins with a young man in Amsterdam, on a night when the world he knew came to an end. The man who dared to think, Spinoza, and the world that shaped him to understand why Spinoza reached the conclusions he did about Moses. It is first necessary to understand who Spinoza was and in what world he lived. Not the world that philosophy books tend to describe, clean and antiseptic, but the real, noisy, bloody and contradictory world of 17th century Europe. Baruch Spinoza was born in November 1632 in Amsterdam, into one of the most respected families of the city's Sephardic Jewish community. His father, Michael de Spinoza, was a successful merchant, and young Baruch grew up surrounded by books, religious debates, and the rich intellectual tradition that Sephardic Jews had preserved even after centuries of persecution. The Jewish community in Amsterdam was a unique case in Europe. While in Portugal and Spain Jews were tortured by the Inquisition, and while in much of the continent they were massacred or expelled, the Republic of the United Provinces, what we now call the Netherlands, had adopted a stance of relative tolerance that allowed Jews to live, work, and practice their faith relatively openly. But do not be mistaken. This tolerance was fragile, conditional, and deeply self-interested. Jews were tolerated because they were useful to international trade, because they brought capital, business networks, and financial knowledge that the Republic needed. And in exchange for this tolerance, it was expected that the Jewish community would remain orderly, discreet, and internally disciplined. Any behavior that brought negative attention, any intellectual agitation that could disturb the Christian authorities of the city, was seen as a threat to collective survival. It is within this context that young Baruch studied. The school he attended, the Talmud Torah, was one of the most rigorous in the diaspora. There, Hebrew, Aramaic, Torah, Talmud, Rashi's commentaries, the medieval disputes of great rabbis, Maimonides' philosophy, and the mysticism of Kabbalah were studied. It was a deep, totalizing education that shaped not only knowledge but the very way of thinking. And Spinoza stood out. From an early age, his teachers recognized in him something that went beyond memory or diligence, an unusual ability to ask questions, not the obedient questions that students asked to confirm what they already knew, but genuine, uncomfortable questions that pointed to contradictions and tensions within the texts everyone studied. The death of his father in 1654 abruptly brought Spinoza into adulthood. At 21, he inherited the family business, the debts associated with it, and the responsibility of caring for his younger siblings. For a few years, he tried to reconcile commerce with studies, importing and selling dried fruits and other colonial products, keeping account books, negotiating credit. But at the same time, his intellectual circle expanded. He had begun to learn Latin with Franciscus van den Enden, a former Jesuit and free thinker who had a school in Amsterdam and exposed his students to the works of great European thinkers, Descartes, Hobbes, Francis Bacon. For Spinoza, contact with this tradition was like opening a window he did not know existed. Here was a world of thought that did not start from the Torah as the final authority. Here were men who questioned everything, the nature of the universe, the foundation of knowledge, the origin of human laws, and who did so with an intellectual rigor that Spinoza found both liberating and absolutely rigorous. The tension between the two worlds grew. Inside the synagogue, Spinoza was a member of the community. Outside of it, he was a young man increasingly fascinated by issues that the synagogue considered dangerous, and the community leaders began to notice this. There are reports, unconfirmed but plausible, that there were a series of conversations, warnings, negotiations. Some historians suggest that the community leaders even offered Spinoza an annual pension if he would simply remain quiet, continue attending ceremonies, and not publish or teach his heterodox ideas. Spinoza, according to this version, refused. In July 1656, Baruch de Spinoza was struck by the herem, the Jewish excommunication, in a ceremony that still today, almost 400 years later, is capable of sending chills down the spine of anyone who reads the original text. We do not know exactly what the specific accusations were. The herem document is vague, speaking of abominations that Spinoza supposedly committed and of evil doctrines that he allegedly taught, but without detailing exactly what they were. What we know is what happened next. Spinoza left Amsterdam. He abandoned commerce. He adopted the Latin name Benedictus, which means the same thing as Baruch in Hebrew, blessed. He began to live simply, polishing optical lenses to support himself, and dedicated the rest of his life to a philosophical work that would change the world. But before entering the work, it is necessary to understand the intellectual context in which it was born. The 17th century European world was a world in turmoil. The Protestant Reformation had fragmented European Christendom, religious wars had killed millions. The scientific revolution was transforming the understanding of the universe. Galileo had been condemned by the Inquisition for asserting that the earth revolved around the sun. Giordano Bruno had been burned alive for his cosmological ideas. In this world, the question that concerned the most serious thinkers was not just theological, it was political. If religious authority is the foundation of all social order, what happens when that authority is questioned? If the sacred texts are not what they claim to be, if they were written by men and not by God, what kind of society can be built on this foundation? Spinoza saw these questions with absolute clarity, and he saw that the only way to answer honestly was to go straight to the heart of the problem, to examine the sacred texts with the same tools used to examine any other text. Rightly so, with historical analysis, with attention to internal contradictions, without prior deference, without the presumption that the text was sacred and therefore infallibly true. This is how the theological political treatise was born. This is how the analysis of Moses was born, and this is how the world was changed forever by a man who polished lenses in a Dutch city and who died at the age of 44 from tuberculosis, without wealth, without declared followers, without public recognition, but whose ideas, 3.5 centuries later, continue to be discussed, feared and admired by anyone who has the courage to sit with them. The herem, the most severe curse in Jewish history. It is possible to hear in the silence of this page the sound of trumpets. Not trumpets of glory, trumpets of condemnation. It is possible to feel the weight of an entire community turning against one of its brightest members with a force that has no equivalent in modern experience. The herem pronounced against Baruch Spinoza on July 27, 1656, is one of the most disturbing documents in the history of Western intellectual thought. Not for the physical violence it describes. There is no condemnation to the stake, no arrest order, no execution, but for the symbolic violence, for the completeness of exclusion, for the calculated coldness with which a community erases one of its members. Read the text, translated from the original Dutch and Hebrew. The Lords of the Council make it known that, having long been aware of the bad opinions and actions of Baruch Spinoza, they have tried by various means and promises to turn him away from his evil ways. Having been unable to remedy this, and on the contrary, receiving more and more information each day about the abominable heresies he practiced and taught, and about his monstrous acts, they resolved, with the agreement of the Lords Hahamim, that the said Spinoza be excommunicated and expelled from the people of Israel. And then comes the curse itself. By decree of the angels, and by order of the saints, we excommunicate, expel, curse, and execrate Baruch Spinoza with the consent of God and this holy congregation, before these holy books with the 613 precepts written therein, with the excommunication with which Joshua cursed Jericho, with the curse with which Elisha cursed the youths, and with all the curses written in the law. Let him be cursed by day and cursed by night, cursed when he lies down, and cursed when he rises up, cursed when he goes out and cursed when he comes in. The Lord will never forgive him. The wrath and fury of the Lord will be kindled against this man, and will cast upon him all the curses written in the book of this law, and the Lord will blot out his name from under heaven. Once the curse was finished, the text prohibited any member of the community from communicating with Spinoza, from reading what he wrote, from being within 4 cubits of him, from sharing the same roof or the same table, from conducting any business with him. For a community that depended entirely on its internal relationships to survive in a hostile world, this was the functional equivalent of death. The excommunicated became, from a social standpoint, a ghost, without family, without friends, without business, without community, without anything. What is remarkable in Spinoza's case is not that he was excommunicated. The herem was a common disciplinary tool within Jewish communities of the time. What is remarkable is the unusual violence of the formulation, the intensity of the curses used, the variety and redundancy of the condemnations accumulated in a single document. This suggests that what Spinoza had done, or had said, or had thought, or had taught, was considered extraordinarily dangerous, not just for the faith but for the survival of the community. At a time when the Jews of Amsterdam were constantly monitored by the city's Calvinist authorities, having among them a young man who openly questioned the authority of Moses, who denied the divine origin of the scriptures, who suggested that miracles were impossible. This young man was an existential threat. And Spinoza? According to all accounts that have reached us, he received the herem with disconcerting calm. He did not protest. He did not appeal. He did not ask for clemency. He simply left. There is an anecdote, perhaps apocryphal but revealing, that someone, shortly after the herem, attempted to assassinate him with a knife. Spinoza supposedly kept the coat torn by the blade as a memento, saying that the episode only confirmed what he already knew about human nature, that men prefer to destroy what they do not understand rather than take the trouble to comprehend it. The expulsion was the starting point for the greatest work of biblical deconstruction that the Western world had ever seen. Free from community obligations, free from the restrictions that Judaism imposed on internal questioning, Spinoza was able to look at the texts he had studied for decades with a completely different perspective. Not the perspective of the believer seeking to confirm his faith, not the perspective of the theologian seeking to defend a doctrine, but the perspective of the philosopher seeking the truth, wherever it may be, regardless of where it leads. And where it led was into the pages of the Pentateuch, the 5 books attributed to Moses, into Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, into the narratives that Western civilization had built about itself over 2,000 years. What he found there is what we will explore in the next block. But first, there is something that needs to be said about you, about the kind of person who has made it this far. You are here at this very moment, walking through the corridors of the same forbidden library that Spinoza walked. You have made it this far because something inside you, that silent voice that is not satisfied with easy answers, recognized that there was something deeper to be discovered. So I need to ask you a question. After everything you have just read, what do you think Spinoza found in the Bible that was so dangerous as to deserve the most severe curse that his community knew? What could be written in the sacred texts that was capable of shaking not just a faith, but an entire social order? Write in the comments now. This space is yours. And while you think about that, if you are not yet part of this channel, subscribe now. Because the next revelations are exactly the kind that history has tried to erase, and you won't want to miss that. The theological political treatise, the philosophical bomb that the world was not ready to receive. There is a special category of books, not many, perhaps a dozen in the entire history of civilization, that when they appear, the world cannot ignore, but also cannot accept. These are books that arrive too early, that say what no one was yet ready to hear, that put into clear and rigorous language what was only present as a restless murmur in the consciousness of a few. The Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, published by Spinoza in 1670, is one of those books. Spinoza published it anonymously. The cover stated that it had been published in Hamburg by a fictitious publisher. He knew that his name on the cover was a death sentence, not necessarily literal but certainly intellectual and civil, and yet he published, because there were things that needed to be said. The treatise is, on the surface, an argument in favor of freedom of thought and expression. Spinoza argues that a stable republic, and he specifically had in mind the Republic of the United Provinces, his adopted homeland, cannot survive if it stifles the free thought of its citizens. That intellectual persecution generates fanaticism, not order. That true political stability requires a separation between religious authority and civil authority. But to reach this political argument, Spinoza first needs to dismantle the foundations upon which religious authority had been built. And these foundations are ultimately the sacred texts, specifically the Torah, the prophets, and the central figure that organizes and gives them meaning, Moses. Spinoza's method in the treatise is what modern scholars call historical textual criticism, but which in 1670 was a radical and frightening novelty. The central idea is simple in formulation and revolutionary in implications. Biblical texts must be interpreted by the same principles used to interpret any other human text. This means paying attention to the original language, the historical context in which the text was written, internal contradictions, repetitions, inconsistencies, all those things that allow us to distinguish what the text actually says from what we want it to say. Spinoza synthesizes this principle in a phrase that is in itself an epistemological revolution. The knowledge of Scripture must be sought only in Scripture itself. What does this mean in practice? It means that you cannot begin reading the Bible with the presupposition that it is the Word of God. Infallibly true in every detail, divinely inspired in every comma. Because if you start with that presupposition, you are no longer reading and you are confirming. You are looking at a text with your eyes closed by a prior belief, It means that you must read the Bible as you would read Homer or Herodotus or any other ancient text, paying attention to its internal history, its probable sources, its contradictions, the political and social context in which it was produced. And when you do that, when you open your eyes and read without the protection of prior faith, what you find is deeply unsettling. The treatise is divided into 20 chapters. The first 6 are dedicated to examining the prophets and prophecy. Chapters 7 and 8 deal with the interpretation of the scriptures. The following chapters specifically examine the Mosaic texts, the law, the history, the narrative of the Exodus, and reach conclusions that led to the book being banned in almost every European country shortly after its publication. The reaction was immediate and violent. The Calvinist religious authorities in the Netherlands formally requested the prohibition of the book. The philosopher Leibniz, one of the greatest thinkers of the time, called it a terrible book that needed to be refuted. A Dutch pastor wrote that it was a book forged in hell, signed by the devil. Another theologian classified it as the most pestilent book the world had ever seen, full of poison that could only come from a demon. These reactions, it should be noted, were not just passionate. They were strategic, because the men who wrote them were smart enough to understand that if Spinoza was right, if the textual foundations of religious authority could be questioned with reason and evidence, then the entire power structure that relied on that authority was in danger. The treatise, as we will see, did not destroy religion. It did not convince believers to abandon their faiths. It did not immediately produce a secularized Europe, but it planted a seed that grew over the following centuries, nourished by every advance in biblical criticism, every archaeological discovery, every more rigorous linguistic analysis, until it became the root of the modern academic view of sacred texts. Today, the vast majority of serious biblical scholars, including committed Christian and Jewish theologians, accept principles that Spinoza formulated in 1670. The idea that the Bible is a human document, produced over centuries by multiple authors, revised and edited by different religious and political traditions, is no longer a revolutionary idea in academic circles. It is the starting point. But in the 17th century it was heresy, and the greatest target of this heresy was not any abstract doctrine. It was a specific man, a historical figure who had been transformed into a symbol of all religious and political authority in the Western world. It was Moses. And it is about Moses that we will speak from now on, with all the depth and courage that this subject demands. Who really wrote the Torah? Spinoza and the question of Mosaic authorship. There is a question that seems simple, almost naive, but when asked seriously, produces an abyss beneath the feet of any Abrahamic religious tradition. Who wrote the Torah? The official answer, taught in Jewish, Christian, and Islamic religious schools for 2,000 years, is clear: Moses. The first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, were written by Moses, inspired directly by God, during the 40 years that the people of Israel wandered in the desert after the Exodus from Egypt. This assertion is fundamental to the structure of all Jewish, Christian, and Islamic theology, because if Moses wrote the Torah under divine inspiration, then the Torah is the Word of God. And if it is the Word of God, then its commandments are mandatory, its narratives are true, its authority is absolute and uncontestable. It was precisely this chain of reasoning that Spinoza decided to examine. And what he found, simply by reading the text carefully, was enough to make the entire chain collapse. The first and most obvious problem is this. Deuteronomy, the 5th book of the Pentateuch, ends with the death of Moses. The text narrates not only the death but the funeral and the lament of the people after the loss of their leader. There is nothing extraordinary about this, except that we are talking about a man who allegedly wrote the books that include the narrative of his own death and burial. Spinoza notes this in chapter 8 of the treatise, with a dry irony characteristic of his style. It is hardly possible that Moses wrote the narrative of his own death. Perhaps someone might argue that he wrote it prophetically, in other words, that God revealed to him how his death would be before it happened, and that Moses recorded it for future reference. Spinoza does not dismiss this possibility outright, but he registers it for what it is, speculation, not an explanation. And then he begins to accumulate evidence. Because the problem of the narrative of Moses' death is just the most visible tip of an iceberg of textual difficulties that lie hidden within the Pentateuch. Let us consider some examples that Spinoza examines carefully. In the book of Genesis, chapter 12, verse 6, we find this phrase, "And the Canaanites were then in the land." The key word is then, at that time, at that moment. This expression only makes sense if the writer looks back at the past and contrasts it with his own present, in which the Canaanites were no longer in the land or were in a different way. But if Moses wrote Genesis, the Canaanites were still in the land. Israel had not conquered Canaan. The temporal distinction makes no sense in a text written by Moses. In the book of Genesis, chapter 36, there is a list of the kings of Edom who reigned before there was a king in Israel. This phrase presupposes that there was an established kingdom of Israel at the time it was written, which, under Moses, simply did not exist. Israel as a kingdom only emerged with Saul and David, centuries after Moses. In Deuteronomy chapter 2, verse 12, it speaks of how the sons of Esau expelled the Horites from their land, just as Israel did with the land of its possession. The verb tense, did, is in the past, presupposing that the conquest of Canaan had already occurred, which again is not possible in a text written by Moses. In Deuteronomy chapter 34, verses 10 to 12, the text says that never again did a prophet arise in Israel like Moses. The phrase "never again did a prophet arise" presupposes a much later historical perspective, someone looking back over generations and able to assert that no prophet reached the level of Moses. This is clearly the voice of someone who lived long after Moses, not the voice of Moses himself. Spinoza also notes that, at various points in the Pentateuch, places are identified by names that only acquired those names in much later periods. In Genesis, for example, the city of Hebron is mentioned by the name Hebron, but Numbers 26:35 tells us that the name Hebron was given to the city only after Caleb conquered it, long after Moses' death. There is also the problem of repetitions and internal contradictions. Spinoza notes that there are two distinct narratives of creation in Genesis, chapters 1 and 2, that use different names for God and describe the sequence of events in incompatible ways. In the first narrative, God creates the animals before the human being. In the second, God creates man before the animals. If Moses wrote all this in sequence, how can the contradiction be explained? There are two distinct narratives of the flood, which even contradict each other about the number of animals that Noah took into the ark. There are two versions of the Ten Commandments, in Exodus and in Deuteronomy, which differ in important details. There are two versions of the story of how Moses received the mission to lead the people, which differ in the details of the theophany. The explanation that Spinoza proposes for this evidence is, by the standards of the 17th century, extraordinarily modern. He suggests that the Pentateuch was not written by a single author, but is a compilation of earlier documents, probably organized by Ezra, the priest and scribe who recopied the Jewish scriptures after the return from the Babylonian exile in the 5th century before Christ. This is essentially what modern scholars call the documentary hypothesis, the theory that the Pentateuch was composed from at least 4 distinct sources, identified by the initials J, E, D, and of the divine. But Spinoza invites us to see it differently. He suggests that this scene is not merely a moment of divine revelation, but a political act of power. The narrative constructs a framework in which Moses becomes the intermediary between God and the people, establishing a hierarchy that places Moses at the center of authority. This is not just about divine law. It is about the consolidation of power in the hands of a few who claim to speak for God. By portraying Moses as the sole recipient of divine commandments, the narrative legitimizes the authority of the leaders who follow him. It creates a system where the laws are seen as absolute, coming directly from God, and thus beyond question. This is a powerful tool for governance, as it allows those in power to maintain control by invoking divine will. The people, terrified by the spectacle of Sinai, are conditioned to accept the authority of Moses, and by extension, the leaders who succeed him. Spinoza's analysis reveals that the construction of Moses as a prophet is not merely a theological assertion, but a political maneuver. The narrative serves to unify the people under a common identity, bound by laws that are presented as sacred and unchangeable. This is crucial for the survival of the community, especially in times of crisis or conflict. The power of the narrative lies in its ability to shape collective memory and identity, ensuring that the people remain loyal to the laws and the leaders who interpret them. Moreover, Spinoza points out that the portrayal of God in the narrative is also politically charged. The image of a powerful, commanding deity who speaks through Moses reinforces the idea that the leaders are divinely sanctioned. This divine endorsement is essential for maintaining order and obedience among the populace. It creates a sense of fear and reverence that discourages dissent and promotes conformity. As we delve deeper into Spinoza's critique, we see that the implications extend beyond the biblical text itself. The way in which religious narratives are constructed can have profound effects on political structures and social dynamics. The intertwining of religion and power is not unique to ancient Israel. It is a recurring theme throughout history. Leaders have often used religious narratives to justify their authority, manipulate public perception, and suppress opposition. In conclusion, Spinoza's examination of the biblical narrative challenges us to reconsider the relationship between religion and politics. By viewing the story of Moses not just as a sacred history, but as a political construction, we gain insight into how power operates through the manipulation of belief. This perspective invites us to question the narratives that shape our own societies and to recognize the ways in which they can be used to uphold or challenge authority. The legacy of Spinoza's thought continues to resonate, reminding us that the intersection of faith and power is a complex and often contentious terrain that shapes human experience across cultures and epochs. God to a people. But Spinoza reads this scene differently. For him, it is above all a political scene, and one of the most effective ever conceived. Think about the problem Moses faced. He had led a slave people out of Egypt, a people who had lived in slavery for generations, who had developed the mental and emotional habits of servitude, who had no experience of self-governance, who venerated the Egyptian gods they had learned to fear, and who, in moments of difficulty, repeatedly longed to return to familiar slavery. Freedom for this people was terrifying. The desert was hostile. The uncertainty of the future was paralyzing. How do you govern such a people? How do you create a collective identity where there was previously only servitude? How do you institute a law that is respected not only when there is a policeman to enforce it, but at all moments of private life, even when no one is watching? The answer that Spinoza sees in the narrative of the Exodus is elegant in its political brutality. You create a God who is always watching, a God who is not just an abstract cosmic force, but who has a personal interest in the obedience of each individual of that specific people. A God who will punish transgressions not only in public life, but in harvests, in diseases, in wars, in the prosperity or misery of each family. An omnipresent, omniscient God, of violent temperament and absolute demands, and to ensure that this God is obeyed, you structure access to God in a way that centralizes power in your own figure. Moses is the only intermediary between God and the people. It is he who ascends to Sinai. It is he who receives the laws. It is he who interprets the divine will when difficult cases arise. It is he who decides when the people are being faithful and when they are being rebellious. It is he who determines which sin deserves which punishment. Spinoza does not suggest that Moses invented God. His philosophy about the nature of God is, as we will see later, much more sophisticated than that. What Spinoza suggests is that Moses, or more precisely, the texts that construct the figure of Moses, present a version of God that is carefully calibrated to serve specific political objectives. The God of Sinai, as described in the Exodus, is not the universal God of reason that Spinoza defended in his Ethics. It is a tribal God who has preferences for a specific people, who participates in battles, who orders genocides, who is pleased by animal sacrifices, who is angered by the idolatry of other peoples. It is a God who, to put it bluntly, seems to have been modeled on the patterns of the polytheistic gods of the ancient Near East, with the crucial difference that it presents itself as unique and exclusive. Spinoza compares Moses' role to that of great legislators of classical antiquity, Lycurgus in Sparta, Numa Pompilius in Rome, who also attributed their laws to a divine authority to ensure their obedience. not because they were necessarily dishonest, but because they understood that purely human laws have a different authority than laws that are perceived as emanating from a transcendent and uncontestable source. But Moses went further than Lycurgus or Numa Pompilius, because unlike them, Moses did not just say that his laws came from God. He created an entire religious structure around that assertion, a structure with priests, rituals, sacred places, religious calendars, a system of sacrifices, dietary prohibitions, laws of purity, all connected to the same source of divine authority, all managed by a priestly class that descended from his own family. The tribe of Levi, the tribe of Moses and Aaron, received the monopoly of the priesthood. The Levites would not have land in the allotment of Canaan, but they would have something much more valuable: control of the temple, of sacrifices, of offerings, of the interpretation of the law. In modern terms, we would say that Moses instituted a theocracy in which spiritual power and political power mutually reinforced each other, and in which privileged access to the divinity was inherited from father to son within a specific family. Spinoza also examines the passages in which Moses deals with dissenters and finds in them a pattern that is more political than religious. When Korah, Dathan, and Abiram question Moses' authority in an extraordinarily interesting episode from the Book of Numbers, the response is not a theological debate. It is the immediate destruction of the dissenters, swallowed by the earth that opens beneath them, in a miracle that conveniently eliminates any organized opposition to Moses' leadership. When the people worship the golden calf during Moses' absence at Sinai, the response is not education or persuasion. It is massacre. The Levites are ordered to kill their own brothers, friends, and neighbors who participated in the idolatry, and 3,000 people are killed in a single day. The political message is unequivocal. Religious disobedience is punished with immediate death, and those who obey Moses' orders, even when it means killing members of their own family, will be rewarded. Spinoza notes that this pattern, the perfect identification between disobedience to God and disobedience to Moses, the immediate and exemplary punishment of dissenters, the material reward for the obedient, is exactly what any political analyst would recognize as the fundamental elements of a system of social control based on religion. This does not necessarily mean that Moses was a cynical tyrant who did not believe in anything he said. Spinoza is careful about this. He suggests that it is possible, even likely, that Moses genuinely believed in his divine mission, that the distinction between what Moses received as genuine revelation and what he constructed as a political instrument may not have been clear even to Moses himself, that great religious leaders often confuse their own will with the divine will. But regardless of Moses' personal psychology, the political effect of his leadership is clear. He built a national identity and a system of government that survived for millennia. And it survived not despite the political use of religion, but because of it. The question that Spinoza poses to his readers is this: when you know that religion has been used politically, when you see the mechanisms of that use clearly, does it change your relationship with religion? Does it change the way you obey it? For Spinoza, the answer was yes, and that was his main transgression. The God of Moses versus the God of Spinoza, a philosophical battle of 3 millennia. Perhaps the most common accusation against Spinoza is that of atheism. His contemporaries called him an atheist. His enemies described him as someone who denied the existence of God. And this accusation was so successful that it persists even today in some popular representations of the philosopher, but the accusation is deeply incorrect. Spinoza did not deny God. He wrote about God with a depth and intensity that few theologians have achieved. His main work, the Ethics, is structured almost entirely around the nature of God and the relationship between God and reality. The problem is that the God of Spinoza was so different from the God of Moses that, for the defenders of the latter, it seemed to be no God at all. To understand the difference, one must first understand what Spinoza meant by his central proposition, which has become one of the most quoted and debated statements in the history of philosophy: Deus sive natura, God, or rather, nature. For Spinoza, God is not a personal being who is above or outside of nature, who created it from nothing, who intervenes in it through miracles, who has preferences and emotions, who gets angry with disobedience and rejoices in sacrifices. This concept of God, the biblical God, the God of Moses, is for Spinoza an anthropomorphic projection. It is an enhanced human being with supernatural powers, but with the same partial, temperamental, and capricious psychology of humans. The God of Spinoza is absolutely different. It is the infinite substance that constitutes all reality. It is the totality of everything that exists, the necessary order of all things, the immanent legality of the universe. It is not above nature because it is nature. It does not act in history because it is the substance of which history is made. This God does not speak in human languages. It has no preferences for specific peoples. It does not order holy wars. It will not punish the wicked nor reward the righteous with material blessings. It is not outside the universe looking in. It is the universe itself, in its necessary and perfect totality. The implication is immediate and devastating for traditional biblical theology. The God that Moses describes does not exist. Or, to be more precise, the personal, tribal, emotional, interventionist and partial God that Moses describes is not God in the profound philosophical sense. It is a human representation, created to serving human purposes. Spinoza argues that the biblical prophets, including Moses, were not philosophers. They did not have access to God through reason, which for Spinoza is the only reliable path to truth. They had access to God through imagination, a faculty that is valid for producing vivid and emotionally powerful representations, but does not produce true knowledge. When Moses describes God as a being who speaks, who has hands, who walks in the Garden of Eden, who smells the sacrifices with satisfaction. When Moses describes God as someone who gets angry with Israel and wants to destroy it, and who needs to be persuaded by Moses to change his mind, all of these are imaginative representations, not philosophical descriptions of the divine nature. Spinoza goes deeper. He argues that the attributes ascribed to God in the Bible, omnipotence, omniscience, justice, mercy, are attributes that humans understand by analogy with their own characteristics. We say that God is just because we understand what human justice is, and then multiply that quality to infinity. We say that God is wise because we understand what human wisdom is, and then project it on a cosmic scale. But this way of knowing God through analogy is fundamentally inadequate, because God, the infinite substance, is of a nature so radically different from finite things that any analogy is more misleading than revealing. To say that God is wise does not tell us more about the real nature of God than saying that the sun is pleasant tells us about solar astronomy. This places Spinoza in a paradoxical position that his critics quickly pointed out. If the true God is so different from the biblical God, if the true God does not speak, does not command, does not punish, does not reward, then what is the practical relevance of Spinoza's theology? What does it mean to pray to an infinite substance that has no interest in you? Spinoza's answer is consistent with the rest of his philosophy. The relevance is not in a personal relationship with a personal God. It is in knowledge. Knowing God, in the Spinozist sense, understanding the necessary order of the universe, comprehending the laws that govern reality, is the highest good that a human being can achieve. And this knowledge produces a specific form of love, the intellectual love of God, which Spinoza describes as the highest possible happiness. It is not the happiness of knowing that you have a powerful Father who takes care of you. It is the happiness of understanding, of seeing, with the clarity of reason, the necessary and perfect order of everything that exists. It is an experience that Spinoza describes in a way that evokes more contemplative states of Eastern meditation than the devotional relationship of Abrahamic religions. The difference between the God of Moses and the God of Spinoza is ultimately the difference between two types of relationship with the Absolute. The first is vertical, personal, based on fear and hope. The small human before the great God, pleading for favor, fearing punishment. The second is horizontal, intellectual, based on understanding. The human who recognizes himself as a necessary part of the infinite totality and finds peace not in submission, but in understanding. For Spinoza, the first form of religion, the religion of Moses, was necessary to govern peoples who did not have access to philosophical reason. It was, in a sense, a simplified and politically useful version of the truth. But it was also, inevitably, a form of control that kept people in a state of childish dependence. The true religion for Spinoza was the intellectual love of God. And this love required no priests, no temples, no sacrifices, nor the exclusive mediation of a legislator who ascended the mountain and descended with stone tablets. It required only reason, and the courage to use it, imagination as an instrument of control, how Moses governed by fear and vision. There is a fundamental distinction in Spinoza's philosophy that is key to understanding all of his analysis of Moses and the prophets, the distinction between imaginative knowledge and rational knowledge. For Spinoza, humans have three types of knowledge. The first is the knowledge of imagination, sensory experience, mental representations, emotional associations, the narratives we construct to make sense of the world. This type of knowledge is the most common, the most accessible, the one that governs the lives of most people most of the time. It is also the least reliable, the most subject to errors and distortions, the most easily manipulated by those who know how to manipulate it. The second type is rational knowledge, the understanding of the necessary causes and connections between things. It is the knowledge produced by rigorous reason, by logic, by mathematics, by science. It is more reliable than imaginative knowledge, but also more difficult, more demanding, more inaccessible to most people. The third type is intuitive knowledge, the direct and immediate apprehension of essences, which Spinoza associates with the intellectual love of God. It is the highest type of knowledge, reserved for those who have reached the highest degree of philosophical understanding. Now, in which category do the biblical prophets fit? In which category does Moses fit? Spinoza answers clearly. In the category of imaginative knowledge. The prophets were not philosophers. They did not arrive at their revelations through the rigorous exercise of reason. They arrived through dreams, visions, hallucinatory experiences, altered states of consciousness that they interpreted as contact with the divine. This does not necessarily mean that the prophets lied. Spinoza is careful about this. He accepts that the prophetic experience was genuine, in the sense that the prophets truly experienced what they described. But the genuine experience of a vision or a dream does not guarantee that the content of the vision is true. It only guarantees that the prophet's imagination produced that specific representation, and imagination, for Spinoza, is deeply influenced by cultural context, by expectations, by individual temperaments, and, crucially, by the political and social needs of the moment in which the prophet lived. Spinoza notes that different biblical prophets had revelations compatible with their own temperaments and cultural backgrounds. Prophets who were warriors had visions of God as a warrior. Prophets who were shepherds had visions of God as a shepherd. Prophets who lived in a time of peace had revelations of peace. Prophets who lived in a time of war had revelations of war and judgment. This is not the pattern one would expect from a truly divine and transcendent source, which should be independent of the cultural contexts of its recipients. It is exactly the pattern one would expect from an imaginative faculty that processes and projects the contents of its own time. As for Moses specifically, Spinoza makes a notable distinction. He recognizes Moses as the greatest of the biblical prophets, but not because Moses had special access to reason or true knowledge. Moses was great because he had the greatest power of imagination and, above all, because he had an unparalleled political genius. The greatness of Moses for Spinoza lay in his ability to translate abstract truths into imaginative language that the people could understand and obey, to transform principles of social coexistence into a narrative of divine covenant that created obligations not only legal but spiritual, to use dramatic sensory experience, the thunders of Sinai, the pillar of fire, the plagues of Egypt, to create an indelible impression on the collective psychology of the people. In other words, Moses was a genius of political communication who used all the resources of human imagination to build a national identity and a system of social obedience that survived for millennia. But the effectiveness of this system came at a price. The price was the maintenance of imagination as the dominant mode of access to God, which in turn kept the people dependent on the intermediary who interpreted the divine revelations. If the people could access God directly through reason, as Spinoza proposed, they would not need priests, nor prophets, nor temples, nor sacrifices. The religious structure of Moses in this reading was not merely an instrument of spirituality. It was an instrument of power that functioned precisely because it kept access to the divine in the hands of a specialized elite. Spinoza goes even further in analyzing the mechanism of control. He observes that the Mosaic law is profoundly different from the universal moral laws that reason can derive by itself. The Mosaic law is full of specific rituals, dietary prohibitions, ceremonial regulations that have no obvious rational justification, that are not derivable from universal moral principles. What is the function of these seemingly arbitrary laws? Spinoza suggests that their function is precisely their apparent arbitrariness. A law that you can derive from reason, do not kill, do not steal, do not lie, is a law that you can, in principle, understand and justify for yourself. You obey not because the priest said, but because you understand why it is right. But a law that says do not eat shrimp, or do not mix milk with meat, or do not wear clothes made of two different fabrics, that law you cannot derive from reason. There is no obvious rational justification. You need to accept the authority of those who promulgate it. And by accepting the authority of this set of arbitrary laws, you reinforce the mental habit of accepting authority, a habit that then extends to everything else. It is a mechanism of intellectual dependency that Spinoza describes with a clarity that goes far beyond the Jewish context. It is the same mechanism that operates in any power system that uses religion as a tool of control. Spinoza's analysis is not a moral condemnation of Moses. It is an understanding of what was necessary and what was possible, at a time when philosophical reason was not available as a governing instrument. Moses did what needed to be done to create a people and keep them united, and he did it brilliantly. But what was necessary in a desert 3,000 years ago for a people of former slaves? Is that what a modern state should impose on its citizens today? Is that what should continue to govern the individual consciences of people who have access to reason, philosophy, and science? For Spinoza, the answer was unequivocal. No. The miracles, fraud, natural phenomenon, or something more disturbing. 10 plagues upon Egypt. The Red Sea divided in two. Manna falling from the sky in the desert. Water gushing from a rock. A pillar of fire guiding the people at night. Clothes that do not wear out over 40 years of wandering. The earth opening up to swallow the rebels. The miracles of the Exodus are the narrative backbone of Moses' story. They are the events that, according to the text, incontrovertibly prove the divine authority behind Mosaic leadership. They are the reason why the people obey, or at least should obey, and they are exactly the kind of event that Spinoza examines with the sharpest scalpel of his entire philosophy. Spinoza's position on miracles is one of the most radical and influential in the entire history of thought. It can be summed up simply: miracles, in the sense of suspensions of natural laws by direct action of God, are impossible, not just improbable, impossible. The reason is as follows. For Spinoza, God and nature are the same thing. God is the necessary and perfect order of all reality. The laws of nature are the expression of that perfect order. For a miracle to occur, for the waters of the Red Sea to divide in violation of the laws of physics and hydrodynamics, God would have to violate his own nature. He would have to contradict himself. And an infinite and perfect substance cannot contradict itself. A perfect order cannot include exceptions to its own perfection. The idea that God could intervene in nature to perform a miracle implies that God is an agent somehow outside of nature, who can manipulate it from the outside, which directly contradicts the Spinozist definition of God as the immanent substance of all reality. Therefore, miracles did not happen as they are described, period. But Spinoza does not stop there. He goes beyond denial and proposes an explanation for what was really happening when the biblical authors describe these extraordinary events. First, there are events that may have natural bases interpreted through a supernatural lens. The plagues of Egypt, for example, mosquitoes, frogs, locusts, hail, darkness, are known natural phenomena in the ancient Near East. The concentration of these events in a specific period and in a specific place could be the result of exceptional environmental conditions, and a people with a providential worldview would naturally interpret this confluence as divine action. The crossing of the Red Sea, or more precisely the Sea of Reeds, as the Hebrew Yam Suf means Sea of Reeds, may have involved a phenomenon of extreme low tide in an area of shallow waters, possible under certain wind and tide conditions. There are historical records of similar events in the same type of geographical environment. Again, a community that sees the hand of God in everything would interpret an extraordinary natural event as a miracle. Second, there is the issue of collective memory and narrative elaboration over time. Even if the events of the Exodus have some historical basis, and many scholars today debate whether the Exodus itself, as a historical event, actually occurred as described, the accounts that have reached us were transmitted orally for generations before being written down. And the oral transmission of extraordinary events tends to naturally magnify them, to add supernatural elements, to transform the memorable into the miraculous. Third, and here Spinoza is bolder, there is the issue of the political function of miracles within the narrative. The miracles of the Exodus have a very specific structure. They occur precisely when Moses' authority is in question, when the people question or resist his leadership. When the people are hungry in the desert and murmur against Moses, manna appears from the sky. When the people are thirsty and begin to complain, Moses strikes a rock and water gushes forth. When Moses' authority is directly challenged by Korah and his followers, the earth opens up and swallows them. When the people become impatient during Moses' absence on Sinai and worship the golden calf, Moses descends from the mountain with his face shining with divine light, and the massacre follows. The pattern is consistent. Miracles function as divine confirmation of Moses' authority. They are signs of legitimation. In a world where political authority was regularly associated with divine favor, the ability to produce, or to be the channel of an extraordinary events, was one of the main ways to establish and maintain leadership. Spinoza also notes that the issue of miracles is inseparable from the issue of textual authority. If miracles did not happen, then the texts that describe them are at the very least inaccurate, and if the texts are inaccurate in such central aspects, then they cannot be used as direct evidence of divine will. And if they cannot be used as divine evidence, then the entire structure of authority that relies on them, from Mosaic law to rabbinic tradition, from Christian theology to Islam, is built on a foundation that is not what it appears to be. The discussion of miracles by Spinoza had a huge impact in the centuries that followed. David Hume, half a century later, developed the argument against miracles in a different but compatible form, that the probability of a miracle is always less than the probability that the witness is mistaken or lying. Therefore, we never have sufficient reason to believe in a miracle account. Kant later treated miracles as unknowable, neither probable nor improbable from the standpoint of pure reason. But it was Spinoza who first articulated the problem with philosophical rigor, and who showed the connection between belief in miracles and the maintenance of a specific structure of religious and political authority. When miracles disappear, what remains of the Exodus narrative? What remains is an extraordinarily skilled leader, in a historical moment of great need, who used all available resources, including the collective imagination of a traumatized people, to build a nation. And he did so with such skill that the narrative he created has survived intact for 3,000 years. For Spinoza, this did not diminish Moses' greatness. On the contrary, it made it more impressive, because creating a miracle is easy, just appeal to the supernatural. But creating a nation, an identity, a system of laws and values that lasts for millennia, that is made of flesh and blood and human mind. And it is precisely in this that lies the problem that Spinoza points out. A people that attributes its cohesion to divine miracles, and not to human intelligence and effort, is a people that does not understand the true sources of its own strength. And a people that does not understand these sources is much more vulnerable to those who wish to manipulate them. The Mosaic Law, political code or divine command. Spinoza's most subversive argument. There is a thought that, once thought, cannot be unthought. Spinoza placed it in chapter 17 of the theological political treatise with a precision that seems almost cruel in its clarity. The law of Moses was not a universal divine law. It was the political constitution of a specific state. And with the destruction of that state, the law lost its obligation. To understand the weight of this statement, one must understand what was at stake. In the 17th century, the Mosaic Law and the Ten Commandments, the laws of Leviticus, the regulations of Deuteronomy, was the foundation of all moral and legal philosophy of the Christian West. The European constitutions, the legal systems, the moral codes that governed the public and private lives of hundreds of millions of people all ultimately traced back to the assertion that these were the commandments of God, revealed to Moses on Sinai. If Spinoza was right, if these commandments were actually a political constitution and not a divine revelation, then the foundation of this entire structure disappeared. Spinoza's central argument is this: read the texts carefully, and you will see that the Mosaic Law makes perfect sense as the law of a specific state with specific characteristics in a specific historical context, and loses much of its meaning when abstracted from that context. For example, the laws regarding the ownership of slaves in Leviticus, the laws about the treatment of conquered peoples in Deuteronomy, the laws concerning animal sacrifices and their specifications, the laws of ritual purity that regulate what can be eaten and touched, when one can enter the temple, how the dead should be treated, the laws regarding religious festivals and their relation to the agricultural calendar of the land of Canaan. All these laws make sense in a very specific context. An agrarian people in a specific territory, with a central temple, with a priestly class, with a king or judge who has political religious authority, in a situation of open borders with enemy and allied peoples. Outside of this context, they not only cease to be relevant, they become impossible to apply. And indeed, Spinoza notes, the rabbis themselves implicitly recognized this when they developed the halakha, the extensive system of interpretation and adaptation of the law that was necessary to make it applicable after the destruction of the temple and the end of the Jewish state. If the law were truly divine and universal, why would it need such adaptation? Spinoza goes deeper. He argues that there are two very different categories of commandments within the Mosaic tradition, which are often confused: universal moral commandments and particularist ceremonial commandments. The universal moral commandments, do not kill, do not steal, honor your parents, do not bear false witness, can be derived by reason independently of any revelation. Any philosopher in any culture would arrive at similar principles through rigorous ethical reasoning. These principles have universal validity because they correspond to truths about human nature and the conditions of life in community. The ceremonial commandments, do not eat shrimp, do not mix milk with meat, circumcise male children on the 8th day, observe the Sabbath in specific ways, offer specific sacrifices on specific occasions, do not have this rational derivability. They only make sense within a particular cultural and historical context. The confusion between these two categories was, for Spinoza, one of the most serious distortions that the religious tradition perpetuated. By presenting the ceremonial commandments as divine commandments of equal weight to the universal moral commandments, the tradition created a false equivalence that had precise political consequences. It made obedience to a specific priestly class in specific rituals as morally obligatory as the prohibition against killing, and thus the perfect mechanism of control was created. You cannot be a good person. You cannot be at peace with God. You cannot be part of the community. You cannot have access to divine blessings without going through the rituals controlled by the priests. Spinoza also analyzes the issue of the Sabbath, the Saturday, with a detail that reveals much about his methodology. The commandment of the Sabbath is presented in Exodus as based on creation. God rested on the 7th day. Therefore, Israel must rest on the 7th day. But in Deuteronomy, the same commandment is presented with a different justification. Israel must observe the Sabbath because it was enslaved in Egypt, and the Sabbath is a memorial of liberation. Two different justifications for the same commandment in the two books that were supposedly written by the same author. This would not be possible if the commandment had a single and coherent divine origin. It is exactly the pattern one would expect from a commandment that has gone through various editorial hands, each adapting it to the argument they wanted to make. Spinoza's analysis of the Mosaic law did not conclude that the law was bad or that there was no wisdom in it. On the contrary, Spinoza expressly admired the political intelligence of the Mosaic legislation as an instrument of social cohesion. What he denied was its divine origin, its universal character, and its obligation for those living outside the political context for which it was created. This had direct implications for the issue of religious freedom, which was, after all, the central political argument of the treatise. If the Mosaic law was a positive law of a specific state, and not the law of God for all humanity, then no civil state had the right to impose it on its citizens outside that context. The Jews could follow it by choice, as part of their cultural and religious identity, but no Christian ruler had the right to use the Mosaic law as a basis for legislating on the bodies and consciences of their subjects. The argument was revolutionary because, by separating the Mosaic law from universal divine law, Spinoza created space for a genuinely secular politics, a politics that did not need a theological foundation, that could be based solely on reason and the common interest of citizens. This is the political heart of the treatise, and that is why it was banned throughout Europe. The prophets, imaginative or inspired. What Spinoza discovered in the prophetic texts. Who were the prophets of Israel? How did prophecy work? Where did the revelations that filled the books of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Amos, Hosea, and all the others come from? Spinoza dedicates the first 6 chapters of the treatise to these questions, and the answers he offers are so unsettling that many of his readers prefer to ignore them rather than confront them. Because if Spinoza is right about the nature of prophecy, then everything that has been thought about divine revelation needs to be rethought from the ground up. Spinoza's starting point is empirical, almost ethnographic. He goes to the text and reads what the prophets themselves say about how they received their revelations, and what he finds is revealing. The biblical prophets do not generally describe a rational understanding experience. They describe visions, dreams, states of trance, the voice of God heard in a storm, in a whisper, in a fire that does not burn. Symbolic figures, wheels within wheels, creatures with multiple faces, horses of different colors. God appearing as a man, sitting on a throne, with coals of fire on his lips. Ezekiel has such hallucinatory visions that medieval rabbis placed restrictions on who could read the first chapter of his book. Children could not, and adults needed specific spiritual preparation. The book of Revelation in the New Testament has a similar character of intense, dreamlike vision. Spinoza observes that this type of experience, vivid, intensely emotional, with powerful images and urgent moral messages, is associated in all human cultures with imagination, not reason, and that the philosophical tradition, from Aristotle to Maimonides, has always been cautious about the epistemic claims of imagination. But Spinoza's question goes beyond individual epistemology. He examines the contents of the prophecies and shows that they vary from prophet to prophet, in ways that suggest influence from cultural and personal context. The prophet Amos, who was a shepherd, uses images of shepherding and agriculture. The prophet Ezekiel, who was a priest, is obsessive about ritual and architectural details. The prophet Isaiah, who lived in the royal court, uses the vocabulary and concerns of international politics. Each prophet projects onto their divine visions the mental categories of their own experience. If God were communicating the same true message to all of them, why this variation? Why would divine revelation be so consistently filtered through the cultural categories of each receiver? Spinoza's explanation: because what is happening is not the transmission of objective truth from God to the prophet. It is the highly developed imagination of the prophet processing their experience of the world, their moral convictions, their perceptions of the needs of their time, and expressing all of this in a language that, within their cultural tradition, is the language of the sacred, the voice of God. Spinoza makes a particularly interesting point about Moses in comparison with the other prophets. The text of Numbers 12, verses 6 to 8 says, "If there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, will make myself known to him in vision, and I will speak to him in dreams. But it is not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. With him I speak mouth to mouth, clearly, and not in riddles." This passage is used by tradition to assert the unique superiority of Moses among all the prophets. While the others receive revelations in visions and dreams, Moses speaks with God face to face, clearly and directly. But Spinoza observes the internal tension of the text. Elsewhere, God himself tells Moses, "You cannot see my face, for man cannot see me and live." How can Moses speak to God face to face if no man can see the face of God? The internal contradiction is unsolvable if the text is taken literally, and if it is not taken literally, if the expression speaking mouth to mouth is treated as a metaphor for special intimacy and communication, then we are already admitting that the text uses figurative language to describe experiences that were, in reality, of another nature. We are admitting that the claim of literalness of the revelation cannot be sustained. Spinoza deepens the argument with an observation about the psychology of prophecy that is surprisingly modern. He suggests that the prophets were people with an extraordinarily vivid and powerful imagination, not with extraordinary reason, and that this imagination was so intense, so convincing to themselves, that they could not distinguish it from real external communication. This is not falsehood. It is a well-documented psychological phenomenon, the ability of certain people to generate internal states of such intensity that they seem objective. Modern research on extreme religious experiences, on trance states, and on high-function hallucinations in completely sane people shows that this type of experience is real, powerful, and transformative, but it is not evidence of a supernatural external source. The distinction that Spinoza draws between prophet and philosopher is therefore the distinction between two types of human cognition: imagination, which is powerful, emotive, and produces vivid representations, but is not reliable as a source of true knowledge, and reason, which is drier, more laborious, but produces truth that can be verified and shared independently of the individual's temperament. The true moral law for Spinoza cannot come from prophecy. It must come from reason, and a law derived from reason does not need prophets to be discovered, nor priests to be interpreted. It is available to any human being who uses their reason properly. This is Spinoza's philosophical democracy, the idea that moral truth is not the property of any priestly class, any privileged tradition, any chosen people. It is the heritage of all rational humanity. And to assert this, he needed to show that the model of prophecy, the model that gave exclusive authority to Moses and his successors, was a human construction, not a divine reality. He showed it. And the world was never the same again. The chosen people, a political myth of Moses or a spiritual reality? Of all the theological concepts that Spinoza examines in the Theological Political Treatise, perhaps none is more delicate and more philosophically rich than the concept of the chosen people. The idea that Israel was specially chosen by God among all the peoples of the earth, that it has a privileged and special relationship with the divine, that it was destined for a specific role in sacred history. This idea is not only theologically central, it is politically potent. And Spinoza, son of Jews who survived centuries of persecution, thanks in part to the cohesion that this idea provided, knew exactly what he was doing when examining it. His analysis begins with a distinction that is elegant in its simplicity. What does it mean exactly to be chosen by God? There are two possible interpretations. The first is spiritual. The people of Israel was chosen to receive a superior understanding of God, a special closeness to the divine, a spiritual illumination that ontologically distinguishes it from other peoples. The second is political and historical. The people of Israel was chosen to establish a specific state, based on specific laws, in a specific territory, in a specific historical period. Spinoza vigorously defends the second interpretation and completely denies the first, and his reasons are, as always, textual before they are philosophical. He cites Deuteronomy itself, which is explicit about the conditional nature of the election. If you obey my laws, you will be my people. If you do not obey, you will be rejected. A conditional election, which can be suspended for non-compliance with conditions, is not the ontological election of an intrinsic spiritual superiority. It is a political contract. Moreover, the biblical text is clear that the election of Israel did not imply moral superiority. The people is called stubborn, hard-headed, ungrateful, rebellious. Moses even tells the people that God did not choose them because they were more numerous or better than other peoples, but simply out of love. A statement that, read philosophically, does not imply any superior quality in the chosen. Spinoza goes deeper. He examines what the election implied in concrete terms. What did the people of Israel receive upon being elected? They received a land. They received laws. They received military victories. They received material prosperity when they obeyed and misery when they disobeyed. In purely material and political terms, they did not receive, Spinoza notes carefully, a superior spiritual illumination. They did not receive an understanding of God that other peoples could not have. The philosophical wisdom of the Greeks, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, is not inferior in any way to the wisdom of the prophets of Israel. The Egyptians, the Chaldeans, the Persians had their own traditions of wisdom that in many respects were comparable or superior to those of the Hebrews. What the election meant, therefore, was the political and historical advantage of having received first an adequate law to build a stable state. It was not a permanent spiritual advantage. It was a circumstantial historical advantage. And with the destruction of the state, with the fall of Jerusalem to Babylon in 586 BC, and then to Rome in 70 AD, this historical election had, by its own conditions, been exhausted. The people continued to exist. The cultural and religious tradition continued to be preserved, but the election as a choice for the constitution of a specific state had fulfilled its purpose or had been suspended. There is obviously something extraordinarily sensitive here. Spinoza was a Jew, or had been a Jew. He was speaking of his own tradition, of his own people, and he was saying that the theological foundation that had sustained this people through centuries of persecution, the certainty of being God's chosen people, of having a special mission in the divine plan, was, in its deepest form, a political assertion, not a spiritual one. But Spinoza was not being hostile. He was being honest, and there was in this honesty a dimension of respect that is not immediately obvious, but becomes clear when reading the treatise as a whole. Because the alternative to the Spinozist reading is to accept that the people of Israel is spiritually superior to other peoples by nature, and therefore that other peoples are spiritually inferior. And Spinoza, with all his philosophy of rational humanity as one, could not accept this hierarchy. The true greatness of Israel for Spinoza was not in an innate spiritual superiority. It was in something much more impressive, the ability to survive, to maintain a coherent collective identity, to preserve an intellectual and moral tradition through millennia of dispersion and persecution. This was not supernatural. It was human in the highest sense, and paradoxically it is also the most suitable foundation for the religious freedom that Spinoza defended. A people that survives not by being ontologically superior, but by having built a robust cultural identity, does not need the protection of a theocratic state. It can survive, indeed it can flourish, in a society that guarantees everyone the freedom of thought and expression. This was the message that Spinoza directed not only to the Jews, but to all. That true human greatness does not come from claims of divine superiority, but from the cultivation of reason, wisdom, and virtue, and that these qualities are accessible to any human being, regardless of their origin, their people, or their tradition. A message that, in the 17th century, was radically egalitarian, a message that, in certain contexts of the 21st century, still is. The reaction. What happened to those who challenged Moses and to those who challenged Spinoza? There is a striking symmetry between what the biblical text describes happening to those who challenged Moses' authority and what happened in real history to those who challenged the authority of the tradition that Moses represented. A symmetry that Spinoza could not have failed to notice because he himself lived it. In the biblical text, the pattern is consistent and brutal. Whoever questions Moses' authority does not survive to see the dawn. Korah, Dathan, and Abiram question the priestly monopoly of Aaron and Moses. The earth swallows them. The two sons of Aaron who offer strange fire to the Lord are consumed by divine fire. The man who collected wood on the Sabbath is stoned to death by all the people at the command of the Lord. Those who lamented the insufficient food, consumed by fire. Those who sent a negative report about the land of Canaan, immediately killed by plague. The political message of this sequence of punishments is clear and was clearly intentional. In a state that grounds its authority in divine will, questioning authority is equated with challenging God. And challenging God is not a matter of opinion, it is a capital crime that threatens the cohesion of the entire community. Spinoza does not need to speculate about this mechanism because he lived it. The herem he received at the age of 24 was not a physical punishment, but it was, in terms of social impact, just as devastating. It was the modern equivalent of being erased from history, cancelled irreversibly, excluded from all forms of community and support. And Spinoza's herem was just one example of a long tradition of violent silencing of those who questioned the religious foundations of power. The history of Western thought is, in part, a history of thinkers who were destroyed by their ideas. Giordano Bruno, the philosopher and cosmologist who asserted that the universe is infinite and that there are inhabited worlds beyond Earth, was burned alive by the Inquisition in 1600, 52 years before Spinoza was born. Galileo, who defended heliocentrism, was sentenced to perpetual house arrest. Michael Servetus, who denied the doctrine of the Trinity, was burned in Geneva by order of Calvin. Thomas Aikenhead, in 1697, was hanged in Scotland for blasphemy. He had publicly stated that the Old Testament was a fable and that Moses had learned his magic in Egypt. The pattern is identical to that of biblical punishments. Those who question sacred authority do not debate. They are destroyed. The questioning itself is considered criminal, regardless of its merits. The idea that there may be something true in a challenge to religious authority is within the system unthinkable by definition. Spinoza survived, which was by no means guaranteed. The theological political treatise was published anonymously for a reason. Spinoza knew that putting his name on the cover was too risky. Even so, his identity as the author became widely known within a few years. There were formal requests for his arrest. There were threats. There were attempts to ban not only the book, but any future publication. Spinoza responded to this pressure in the only way compatible with his principles. He continued to write, but left the publication of the Ethics for after his death. The most radical book, the one that contained his complete metaphysics and his total rejection of the anthropomorphic God, was only published in 1677, a few months after his death from tuberculosis. But the history of reactions to Spinoza's thought does not end with his death. On the contrary, the condemnation lasted for centuries. In 18th century France, Voltairians and encyclopedists cited Spinoza with secret respect, but publicly with caution. In Germany, Leibniz, who had secretly studied Spinoza and extracted much from his thought, publicly kept a safe distance. The so-called Spinozismus was for decades a philosophical accusation equivalent to atheism. Only in the early 19th century, more than 120 years after Spinoza's death, did what was called rehabilitation begin. The poet Novalis called him a man intoxicated with God. The philosopher Hegel incorporated central elements of Spinozism into his system. The poet Goethe had a portrait of Spinoza in his studio, but the rehabilitation was never complete. Spinoza's works remained on the Index of Forbidden Books of the Catholic Church until 1966, 310 years after the herem. The herem of the Amsterdam synagogue was never formally revoked. There was an effort to do so in the 1990s that failed. Spinoza remains in Orthodox Judaism a pariah. There is an irony here that Spinoza would certainly have appreciated. His analyses of how religious institutions treat those who challenge them have, over the centuries, been perfectly confirmed by the behavior of the very institutions he described. Every prohibition of the treatise, every condemnation of his philosophy, every attempt to erase his name, all of this precisely confirmed what he had written about the relationship between religious power and control of thought. And what ultimately happened, not what Spinoza was, but what the world became. The world gradually became more Spinozist than his contemporaries would have imagined possible. The freedom of the press and of expression that Spinoza defended in the treatise is today considered a fundamental right in democratic societies. The separation between religious authority and civil authority, one of the pillars of the political argument of the treatise, is the organizing principle of modern liberal democracies. The historical textual criticism that Spinoza inaugurated is now the standard method in all serious biblical studies departments around the world. Moses governed his people by fear and vision. Spinoza proposed to govern by reason. 350 years later, the question of which of these forms of government is more sustainable, more worthy of human nature, more capable of producing happiness, that question is still open, and the tension between them still structures, in ways we do not always recognize, the deepest conflicts of our time. Did Spinoza have reason? The legacy of a heresy that keeps growing. We have reached the end, not the end of history, this history has no end, but the end of the journey we have taken together through the thought of Baruch Spinoza, through the texts he studied, through the analyses he produced at the risk of everything he had. And now the question that cannot be avoided: did Spinoza have reason? Before answering, it is necessary to be precise about what exactly it means to have reason in this context, because Spinoza made many distinct claims, and they deserve to be evaluated separately. Regarding the textual question about whether Moses really wrote the Pentateuch, the modern academic answer is an overwhelming consensus that vindicates Spinoza. The documentary hypothesis, developed in the 19th century but anticipated by Spinoza in the 17th, is today the starting point of any serious study of the Pentateuch. Committed Christian and Jewish theologians, people who are in no way atheists or skeptics, accept that the Pentateuch is a compilation of multiple sources, that its final form emerged centuries after Moses, that there are anachronisms and internal contradictions that cannot be explained by direct Mosaic authorship. Regarding the question of miracles, the debate continues, but the weight of philosophical and scientific argument is clearly on Spinoza's side. The idea of the suspension of natural laws by direct divine agency is, for most contemporary philosophers and scientists, unsustainable. Modern theologians who want to preserve the concept of miracle generally do so in ways that are very close to the Spinozist position, treating miracles not as violations of natural laws, but as extraordinary natural events that acquire spiritual significance in the context of a life of faith. Regarding the nature of Mosaic law as the political law of a specific state, the historical and archaeological research of recent decades has largely confirmed the framework that Spinoza painted. The legal texts of the Pentateuch, examined in their comparative historical context, are clearly similar to other legal texts from the ancient Near East. They have their specificities and originalities, but are embedded in a regional legal tradition that cannot be separated from its political contexts. Regarding prophecy as an imaginative rather than rational phenomenon, modern psychology of religion offers a framework very close to the Spinozist one for understanding the experiences of the prophets. Studies on altered states of consciousness, on mystical experiences, on hallucinations in contexts of intense faith, all of this points to an understanding of the prophets as people with extraordinarily intense imagination, living in cultural contexts that provided the language of divine revelation and producing genuinely important messages, even without those messages needing to be literally conveyed by an external deity. Regarding the immanent God, the formula Deus sive natura, the philosophical debate is the most vibrant of all. Spinoza's pantheism has been defended and attacked by great philosophers since the 17th century. But it is notable that many of the greatest modern scientists, Einstein is the most famous example, have expressed sympathy for a type of religiosity that comes very close to the Spinozist God. A wonder at the order and beauty of the universe, an experience of the whole as sacred, without any pretense of a personal God intervening in history. Spinoza was therefore right on many of the essential points of his analysis. But that is not the most important thing. The most important thing is the question that this analysis raises, the question with which any serious reflection on Spinozist thought must end. If Moses was a political genius who used religion to create a nation and keep it united, if the sacred texts are human documents that reflect the needs and visions of their time, if miracles are natural phenomena interpreted through a supernatural lens, if the God of the Bible is an imaginative representation of a reality that transcends any image, if all of this is true, what do we do with it? Spinoza did not propose the destruction of religion. This is a persistent and unfair misunderstanding. What he proposed was a transformation of religion, from a religion based on fear, obedience, imagination, and priestly control, to a religion based on love, understanding, reason, and individual freedom of conscience. For Spinoza, true religion did not require temples, priests, or exclusive revelations. It needed only two things: the practice of justice in relationships among human beings and the intellectual love of God, the effort to understand as deeply as possible the necessary and perfect order that constitutes reality. These two things were, for him, the essence of all true religiosity, and they were available to any rational human being, from any tradition, at any time. This is not the atheism that his enemies proclaimed. It is, in its own way, a profound spiritual humanism that recognizes the sacredness of reason, the intrinsic dignity of every conscious human being, and the greatness of a universe that does not require supernatural interventions to be infinitely admirable. Did Moses deceive the people? The question deserves a nuanced answer. Moses, or more precisely, the set of texts and traditions that constructed the figure of Moses, created a narrative that served specific political purposes and that was not the literal and factual description it pretended to be. In that sense, yes, there was deception, or at least a truth that was not the one appearing on the surface. But the people that Moses governed were a people who needed that narrative. A people of former slaves, landless, without a state, without a consolidated collective identity, in a hostile desert, surrounded by enemies. For that people, at that moment, the narrative of being the chosen people of an all-powerful God who would lead them to the promised land was not only emotionally sustaining, it was functionally necessary for collective survival. The problem was not the narrative itself. The problem was, and Spinoza saw it clearly, what happened when that narrative, suitable for a people in a desert 3,000 years ago, continued to be imposed on people living in completely different realities. When the imagination of a brilliant legislator from 3,000 years ago became a straitjacket for the thinking of men and women who now had access to philosophical reason, science, and critical history. Spinoza's legacy is not atheism, it is freedom, the freedom to read sacred texts with intellectual honesty, the freedom to distinguish what serves control from what serves truth, the freedom to love God, whatever our understanding of God may be, not out of fear of punishment, but out of genuine love for what is real, true, and beautiful. 350 years after a young Jew was cursed in a synagogue in Amsterdam, the questions he raised with such courage are still open. They still disturb us. They still compel us to think more deeply than we would feel comfortable. This is the greatest compliment one can pay to any philosopher. Baruch Spinoza died in 1677, polishing lenses, living in a rented room, without family, without fortune, without official recognition. But he had done something that no religious power could undo. He had thought with absolute freedom, and he had written what he thought so that others could do the same. And now you have reached the end of this journey. You have traversed the same text that Spinoza traversed. You have heard the same arguments that shook the foundations of theological empires. The question that remains is not whether you agree with Spinoza, it is what you will do with the thought he planted in your mind. Because this kind of seed does not stop growing. Write in the comments what disturbed you the most. What did Spinoza see that you had never seen? And if you are not yet part of this channel, this is the moment, because there is so much more to discover. And the next chapter is already beginning.